And over to you, James. Tell us a little bit more about the book Stellar. I think you have a copy of it right there, right?
This is a book. Yeah. So this is, I mean, Stellar is a result of a kind of a 9-year collaboration with my co-author, Tony Seba, who's also my co-founder at RethinkX. And really it represents our kind of, I guess, our meta view of where we are today and kind of where we might be going tomorrow. And I guess, you know, I'll run through the book quickly, and I think you wanted to leave plenty of time for a kind of a broader discussion. So, I mean, the book really is about, you know, human civilization, right? And what causes our civilization to be the way it is, and where we might go. And so the first part of the book kind of looks back at history, and the reason for doing that is to understand kind of what really drives society, right? What really causes our world to be the way it is, and that's helpful to try and give us insight on how we deal with the kind of problems that we face today. But by seeing what's really at the root of civilization, it also kind of opens our eyes to the changes that are coming and how the next phase of human civilization might be fundamentally different. And so for us, you know, when we dive deep, you know, what we found at the root of civilization is really the kind of the paradigm of production. Okay, and by that I mean the way in which we meet our needs, or produce the things to meet our needs. So we have a paradigm of production today that's the same as it was at the kind of the dawn of the Neolithic age, right? When we settled down as farmers, which basically takes inputs, right? And if you're an economist, you call them land, labor, capital, or if you're a physicist, you might talk about matter, energy, and information, right? But it takes external inputs. And those inputs are excludable, right? So either I have them or you have them. And we apply knowledge or technology to them to produce the outputs that we want, right? And when you have a system like that based on excludable and external inputs, essentially you find yourself in a competitive world, right? So the early farmers, as their villages grew, found themselves in competition with the next door villages for access to those inputs, for control of those inputs. And so you're in a world essentially where you have to create growth, right? Growth in technological capabilities, growth in scale and reach, you know, growth in military power, or else, you know, essentially you become an input into someone else's system. So we talk about, you know, the dynamic being grow or get outgrown, you know, exploit or be exploited. And that's really what's at the heart of the civilization. So if you look at what comes out of that root, we think of that as the kind of the root of civilization, then everything about our societies kind of grows from that root, right? So what we see in terms of the way we organize society, and by that I mean our economic, our political, and our social systems and structures, they're driven by that need to create competitive advantage, right? Essentially that's you know, we think of it as the evolutionary context of civilization. Right, and what's selecting for what wins is essentially you know, the ability to create growth or to create competitive advantage. So, you know, if we go all the way back to Sumerian times, you know, the first great human civilization 5,000 years ago, we see pretty much the same structure of society, right, at its root. So we see, you know, economically, we see private ownership of property. You know, we see markets and trade. We see money and debt. We see division of labor. You know, we see central governments and hierarchy, but we also see the same kind of problems that we face today. We see, you know, environmental degradation, we see inequality and slavery, and we see conflict kind of inherent in the system. And so not only do our kind of what we term the organizing system, the way we organize societies, grow from that root, the things that confer an advantage get selected, but we have the same types of problems. Right, and our argument is that those problems that we face, whether it's climate change or inequality, are essentially the essence of the system. Right, they're hardwired into that system, and by that I mean it's an advantage to exploit people. Right, you get cheap labor. It's an advantage to exploit the planet. Right, you get cheap resources, and it's really important to understand that, because if we think about solving any of these kind of intractable problems that we face, if you don't understand what's at the root, essentially all you're doing is treating symptoms, right, of that root. So if we think about solving climate change and we talk about capitalism being the problem, right, we haven't gone deep enough. We haven't got to the root, because we have capitalism as a kind of the leading economic system, because it confers an advantage within that context. So we can't make capitalism kind of cleaner or greener or regenerative. Right. So any form of extraction, which an extraction is a term for our current system of production, can't be clean, right? It can't be fair, and it can't be peaceful. All we're able to do is make it a bit less bad in any of those dimensions, right? But we can only make it less bad to the extent that we don't affect our competitive advantage. Right? And that's really important to understand. And that's only relevant if something else is possible. Right, and that something else is what we call the stellar world, right? And we think we're on the cusp of this world emerging. And what I mean by a stellar world is a world essentially where those inputs, land, labor, capital, are essentially embodied within the technology, right? So we think about solar as a kind of, as an example of a stellar technology. Right, you need a huge amount of labor, a huge amount of energy, a huge amount of resource to create a solar panel. But once it's built, it just radiates energy. Right, it requires no further inputs for 30 or 50 or even even more years. Artificial intelligence has essentially the same dynamics. Right, you need a huge amount of data, a huge amount of energy, a huge amount of resource to create an artificial intelligence. But at a certain point in time, essentially the intelligence becomes embodied within the technology and it begins to self-improve. We're not quite sure at what point in time that happens, but that's the promise. At some point it will essentially redesign itself. And so when we have what we call artificial labor, which is AI plus robotics, right? So artificial labor essentially can then rebuild the energy system, can redesign it, improve it. And so, the same molecules and atoms embodied in the first generation of that stellar energy system can, over time, produce more and more energy. And the reason we call this a stellar system is because it's like a star, right? You need certain materials, within certain conditions, and essentially it self-ignites and produces output for no further input, essentially in perpetuity, right? And we think the same promise exists essentially on Earth with the technologies we're developing today, with stellar energy and with stellar labor or intelligence. We can produce anything we need, right? Everything else follows: food, education, healthcare, so on and so forth. That they're the core of a stellar system. And what you have is a system that at a certain point in time becomes self-sufficient, self-repairing, self-building. So it requires no further inputs to continue to produce outputs. And if such a system emerges, then everything changes, right? That root of extraction, dies. And essentially what had an advantage in the old world will no longer have an advantage in the new world. In fact, many of the structures and behaviors that conferred an advantage might actually have a disadvantage. Right? So if we think about it in terms of raw economics, if we think about kind of, 3 cities side by side, you have a stellar, you have one system with kind of extractive power, one with stellar energy, and then one with the full stellar system. What you'll find is that an extractive energy system is just higher cost. It's less competitive. A stellar energy system would be lower cost. You'd have zero marginal cost of energy, but you'd still require a return on capital if you had private ownership. If you had a system where you actually had different economic and political system, and I'm not going to dive into the details of that, although we cover it in the book, you'd have essentially zero cost. With no inputs, there is no cost, right? You'd have zero marginal cost and zero capital cost, essentially. With a new private ownership is one of the key issues that we dive into in the book, because private ownership is something in an extractive context has always conferred an advantage. Right? The alternative has been outcompeted by a system that has private ownership, so it creates the right kinds of incentives. But in a stellar world, it purely adds cost. Right? It requires a return on capital and is less competitive. So I'm gonna stop in a second, but I just want to talk about the journey between the two, because what we have here is a kind of a basic map. Right? We have the world of today, the world of extraction. There's the potential of this stellar world, a decade or two in the future. But the question is, how do we travel between these worlds? And obviously that's where it kind of gets messy. And I think it's just important to have a kind of an orientation or an understanding of how change happens. So we talk about a couple of things in the book that are really important to understand when we think about change. The first comes from a quote, essentially, that we heard Buckminster, that we took from Buckminster Fuller, which is, there's nothing about a caterpillar that tells you it's going to become a butterfly. Right? So it's this idea that the new system is not just the old system with new technology plugged in. Right? It's a fundamentally different system. Right? And any of you who understand how complex systems function will understand that you have stable systems that are held in place and are held stable essentially by what's termed negative feedback loops, right? These forces that resist change. Complex system scientist draws that as a kind of a marble sitting at the bottom of a valley, right? That you give it a push, there's some impetus for change, but it will just roll back into the valley, right? It constrains it. But at other points in time, when those negative feedback loops break down, it's as if the marble is sitting on top of a hill, and it just requires a little push, and it tumbles down the mountain. And essentially that's where we are across society. We think we're coming to this point where our stable system is beginning to unwind, and change is not just easier, it's actually inevitable. Right? And so at a technological level, we think it's inevitable that these stellar technologies outcompete the old extractive ones. It's inevitable. They're cheaper and they're better, and we see that happening across the board. But there are really three levels of change that we have to deal with to get to this fully stellar system. The first level is technological, right? And we see that happening. We think there's an inevitability to change. The second level are the kind of the systems, right? Not just the economic, political, and social structures that are kind of optimized around that old world, but also let's say at the energy system level, the market structure, the regulatory structure, the business model, and so on. Because if we don't get those right, we end up essentially with what we call a chimera, which is essentially a caterpillar with wings stuck on. Right? It's not a butterfly. It won't fly. And we see that happening in the energy sector today. The reason we have these kind of incredible cost curves for solar and wind, but yet we have increasing consumer energy prices, is because essentially we're building a chimera within the energy space today. We're essentially shoehorning solar and wind, which are stellar technologies, into the old centralized infrastructure, market structure, regulatory structure, and so on. It's why we have 10-year queues for connection in California. It's why we've got all these kinds of problems. And when you do that, you don't get the benefit of the new technologies, and you get a host of new problems. Right? And again, we deal with this in the book, and in 15 minutes, I haven't got time to kind of dive into the details. So that's the second level of change. We need not just a change to the technology, but a change to the systems that surround them. And again, this is not kind of wishful thinking. The reason we'll get change to the systems, right, is that those that do change their systems will just outcompete those that don't, right? So it's the idea that change always comes from the edge, that someone somewhere does something different and outcompetes those that don't. And I think, from our perspective, it's very difficult for, say, Western Europe or the US federally to make the kind of changes that need to be made because there's too much incumbency, too much resistance. But there are parts of the world where that incumbency doesn't exist, where change will happen, and we're beginning to see it happen, and we think that they'll race ahead. And then the third level of change, and I'm not going to go into this at all, is kind of the human. Right, and we make the argument in the book that human nature as we understand it is merely human nature with an extraction, right? That all of our social sciences are based on understanding humanity in the extractive context in which we find ourselves, that each and every one of us are capable of a huge spectrum of ways of thinking, of emotions, of behaviors, of relationships, and so on and so forth. But that extraction tilts us towards the darker side, that there's an advantage with an extraction to greed or aggression, so on and so forth. And that context is critical to understand, that we have, through ourselves, in terms of our neural pathways, in terms of our guts and our hormones, in terms of our epigenetics, we have plasticity to our systems, right? And that actually it's the context that matters. So that all the social sciences, from economics at the harder end to kind of psychology at the softer end, are based on understanding us in that extractive context, and that when the context changes, we ourselves have the potential to change fundamentally as well. I think I'm going to stop there. That's there's a lot to take in. The book covers an awful lot of turf.
I got some notes here, and we're recording it, and it made me curious to study the book. Perhaps, if okay, I can pass it to you, Morten, because you are actually the one in the community who alerted us to this work. Would you mind sharing with the book club here what piqued your curiosity?
Yes, of course. I don't really want to take the stage here, but I'm happy to open on that. So, like I said, James, just before we opened the call, is that you really offered me a destination in the work I have been doing. I've been trying to understand what's going on with scaled agile and why it's breaking down. And quite simply, I think that's breaking down because it's inherently built on what you just talked about. But now we have a need where you really need strategic agility, which requires flexibility that no hierarchy can really deal with because it's dealt with one situation. So I basically learned about a new role of strategy to not be like a North Star, but more be like a navigational instrument for you to understand the world. And with that, it also becomes contextual, fractal, which means that it has relevance at all levels, which undermines a few of the things that the Harvard Business School professors have been preaching, like strategy is not planning and only one strategy. And then I think what really helped bring it across was this idea of the no-cost society. I have been looking for things. So, for example, artificial intelligence is catalytic, not transformative. So SAP, you buy it, and 10 years later, you organize around it. You cannot do that with artificial intelligence. It hits you everywhere. And if you're already bad, it will make you even worse, because that's how stuff like that works. So you need to figure it out in a different way. And I already saw the issue with openness, meaning artificial intelligence requires access to information, and it's the relevance of the information that's important, that you know which pieces to pick. But the traditional organization has been built on hiding information and making information power. And those two things do not gel. I think you use much wiser words for it than me. So quite simple, it offered the one side of a bracket I see happening at the moment. And obviously you offer the stellar period as one of three, meaning gatherer, hunter, excavation. And I'm on a different time scale. So I'm thinking rather in Rita McGrath's term, where her last period was called transient. And I think that's now breaking down for the reasons you talk about. And I have named the next period liquid, which is about the ability to pursue opportunity to freely.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that that liquid period we're coming into is a period essentially where the old certainties break down, right? The old structures no longer serve, and the new have yet to emerge.
Yeah.
So we draw in the book a kind of X curve of the breakdown of the old and the breakthrough of the new. And that period, it is liquid. I mean, it's a period of breakdown. I think part of, just briefly, I think part of the issue here is our minds are trapped within extraction, right? It's a world we understand. It's all we see. We can't see beyond that box. And so we're trapped, essentially, and this is the sort of the political debate that's going on around the world. It's you know, do we patch up the systems of extraction and make them less bad, which is kind of what the Democrats in America, many places in Europe are doing, or do we tear them down, which is kind of Trump's approach. It fails to see that there's actually sort of a fundamentally different world emerging, and it's as that much more distributed, networked world emerges, what served us in extraction is serving us less well right now. We have kind of chimera in the information space right now. It's leading kind of misinformation and polarization and all these kinds of and all these kinds of problems. And it is that emergence of, I mean, the stellar world is a much more kind of networked yet connected world. So it's a kind of, we think of a kind of network and node structure that's fractal at all levels, from the individual through to global society. But it's that kind of dynamic where it's self-sufficient at the node but interconnected and learning, essentially. And it's that mismatch of that structure. All the extractive structures are sort of hierarchical and command and control. That's what worked well previously, and it's that difficult period we're in of transformation, essentially. I mean, metamorphosis is painful by nature.
Tom, you used the old school way of raising your hand. I appreciate it. I see you, so it's your turn.
Thank you. I'm probably trapped in the extractive world, but I see what you're promising is an infinite world of perpetual motion machines. Physically impossible. And the people that own the machines will be extracting their value. So you'll have to pay the people that supply you with your electricity from your solar generators. I can't see a way out of this. Can you?
Yeah, no, look, I hear you. I think, look, ultimately, at the highest level, right, an extractive system can't endure, right? Just can't survive. It just depletes, people and planet, right? It's the nature of the system. It's a high entropy system, right? A stellar system, the only input that's required is the light from the sun, right? So at an Earth system level, it can become regenerative, right? It has fundamentally different properties. So the question is not, well, the first question is, how do we create a society that endures, right? And only a stellar world has that potential. You're right. I mean, we talk about ownership that's the chimera I was talking about. It's where we get these stellar technologies, so zero cost, or at least zero marginal cost technologies, potentially zero cost technology. But if we shoehorn them into the old extractive organizing structures, i.e. private ownership and the kind of political stuff, exactly as you say, it's going to be a horrible dystopia. It'd be the worst dystopia we've ever seen, actually, because what we'll have is Silicon Valley or China essentially owning the world's labor, right? I mean, it's going to be the most unequal world. And actually, historically, in times of extraction, humanity has always been needed for our labor, right? So we've always had a card to play and the ability to kind of organize and at least extract some value. In the kind of world we're going to, right? What do we do? How do we protest? How do we rebalance? I mean, it could be, you're absolutely right. I think what we're saying, though, is, look, it doesn't have to be that way. There is an alternative, because when you require no further inputs, right, there is no advantage to private ownership. You're right. We're heading directly today towards that chimera, right? I mean, without doubt. I mean, that's the path that we're on. We're moving towards, stellar technologies and the old extractive ownership forms. But the bottom line is that if we changed ownership models, right, and or didn't have ownership, it was kind of, if everyone had the right to stand in the sun, right, as an alternative, if someone somewhere did that, their system, even within the rules of extraction, would outcompete, right? You'd have zero cost energy, right? You'd have zero cost labor, essentially, because you need no further inputs. You've got the ownership right at the outset. So there is a potential, right, and a mechanism to get there, because it outcompetes. The question is, are we going to find ourselves just trapped in that world ahead of time? And part of the challenge is to create that vision of an alternative, right, and create demand for it. So there's a political and a kind of movement building element to getting there. But there's also just getting on and doing it and beginning that process of outcompeting. And we do have the capability of doing that. I don't want to go into too much detail. I know we're running out of time, but we talk about, we're coming into this period, for instance, we think it's actually hugely deflationary, right? So energy and labor are two of the things that are most inflationary in our economy right now. And they're about to, well, not about to, but at some point over the next decade, energy costs and labor costs will move essentially onto a technology cost curve. And will become cheaper and cheaper and trending essentially towards zero. And that's hugely deflationary. So it gives us a capacity, for instance, to print a lot of money. In fact, we'll have to print a lot of money to save against default. And so we have a concept in the book. We talk about something we term print and build, the idea that we use this money to build the new system and by doing so transform ownership, right? It's one option. There are a couple of other options that we talk about in the book, but you're right, and we're heading headlong towards that world. The first step is to see where we're heading and to see the alternatives. The second step is to get on and do something and to change it. But yeah, I totally agree with you. The most likely outcome is this chimera.
So we're coming up at the end. What an amazing conversation it's been. Perhaps for the last minute, James, would you mind again, perhaps finishing where we started, holding up the book? Let's say one of us picks it up in the local bookshop in a not too distant future, and then tell us in like 1 minute what awaits us in the book. You said it starts with looking back. That's good. What are the other chapters? Or tell us a little bit more.
Okay, so here's the book. You won't buy it in a bookshop. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it through Apple. It's a very available soft copy, hard copy. We'll have an audio book soon, and you can get a Kindle version of it. It's really a study. It's in 3 parts. The past and present, the future, and then the journey between the 2 places, right? And it's an attempt to create a map for humanity of the places we might go from here. What won't happen is that our world of today will continue into the future, right? There are 3 possible pathways. One is a pathway to this stellar world, which is the optimal pathway, but today is extremely unlikely. 2 is this kind of chimera, what we call the caterpillar with wings stuck on, that dystopian alternative that we're kind of headed towards. And the 3rd is a kind of collapse state, right? And that's been the history of humanity. I mean, our previous book called Rethinking Humanity looked at the history of civilizations essentially, and we've seen the same dynamics play out time and time again. Wow.
What a way to end the call. Thank you, James. Cliffhanger.
Pleasure.
Go grab a copy of the book. Thank you so much, James, for finding the time to join us and to share more. Congratulations once again on the book. It's not that old. It's not been out for that long. How many pages is it?
250 or so. And it's been written. I wrote it with my 15-year-old daughter in mind, so it should be.
So you can. It's a nice way you can bring it to the beach and whatever else is in season coming up. Thank you once again, James. Thanks to everybody who joined us. Let's keep this conversation going. I really appreciate the opportunity to look a little bit further into the future. So thank you very much for sharing your thinking on that subject.
No, pleasure. Thanks for reaching out, James.
All the best.
Bye-bye. Take care.
Bye now.